This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek in Pacifica, and we have covered the whole crisis in an accident in East Palestine, the Norfolk Southern wreck, and the ramifications of that with the toxins and other disasters that have befell the people there, housing and healthcare and the environment. And joining us today is Mike Schade. He's with Toxin Free Future, and they have issued a letter on the 1 year anniversary of this disaster, ecological problem that they're facing now. And the letter has covered many of the issues that we're going to discuss here today that face the people and workers of East Palestine and the people of this country as a result of that train wreck and the vinyl chloride that was released from those rail cars. So welcome to our show, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So why don't you first talk about Toxin Free Future, what your organization and what you've been trying to do and educate people in the United States about these issues.
Toxic Free Future, we're a national environmental health advocacy and research organization. We've been around for about 40 years, and we work to protect the public from exposure to dangerous chemicals like vinyl chloride. We are really focusing on preventing exposure to dangerous chemicals like vinyl chloride and protecting communities and workers and everyday consumers from exposure to hazardous chemicals that are all around us. We conduct original scientific research into exposure to and health risks of everyday chemicals around us. We also work to advocate for policy reform at the state and the federal level. We're based in Washington State, so we've long been working to enact legislation in Washington State to regulate chemicals like vinyl chloride and others. We've also been very busy at the federal level. For years, we worked to reform TSCA, the law that regulates chemicals like vinyl chloride. We got legislation passed in 2016 that finally gives EPA authority to regulate harmful chemicals. And then we also work in the marketplace. We advocate for we work to hold big retailers accountable, companies like Walmart and Amazon that sell products and packaging that are often laden with everyday dangerous toxic chemicals. So we work on original research. We also fight for policy at the state and the federal level, and then we work to hold big corporations accountable for selling products and packaging that contain dangerous chemicals.
Okay, well, that's a wide range of activities you're involved in. Maybe we can talk about this man-made accident in East Palestine. This vinyl chloride is moved around the rails in this country. Most people don't know where it's at. Even officials don't know where it's at, and that's one of the issues in that train wreck that took place in East Palestine. The whole first point is that when there was the wreck, apparently, even though there was vinyl chloride in the trains, the EPA basically let Norfolk Southern handle that accident. And that is one of the issues. They ignited it because they said that that was the only way they could deal with it. And that led to further contamination. This oversight of vinyl chloride and these accidents with highly toxic chemicals seems to be a systemic problem.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've known about the dangers of vinyl chloride going back to the 1970s when workers in plastics plants started developing health problems, including angiosarcoma of the liver, which is a rare form of liver cancer. Workers, their bones and their hands were also degrading. And at the same time, they were conducting studies not only on workers, but also laboratory rats. And one of the things they found that the diseases that the rats were getting were also some of the same health problems that workers were experiencing in the factories in places like Louisiana, Texas, Kentucky. So we've known about the dangers of vinyl chloride and other chemicals associated with PVC plastic for decades. So I mentioned that because over 99% of vinyl chloride is used to make PVC plastic, which is commonly found in building materials, packaging, kids' toys. And unfortunately, the production, the use, and the disposal of this plastic poses serious risks to public health and the environment, including to workers at every stage of its life cycle. And this is also a major issue of environmental justice and racism because most vinyl chloride PVC plastic factories are located in low-income communities and communities of color. Historically, we've seen communities in places like Louisiana and Texas devastated by the production and disposal of vinyl chloride. Uh, in the United States, on average, the petrochemical industry releases more than 400,000 pounds of vinyl chloride into the air on an annual basis. And uh, communities not only face serious air pollution, but also water pollution problems. And in fact, contamination in some communities has been so severe that entire neighborhoods have been forced to evacuate or relocate because of contamination. And so we've seen the problems of manufacturing, using, disposing of vinyl chloride over the years, and the disaster that took place in East Palestine nearly 1 year ago highlights also the ongoing risks of transporting vinyl chloride by rail. And in the event of a major derailment, how that can spell disaster for not only residents, but also first responders who often are ill prepared to respond to a major chemical catastrophe like we saw in East Palestine last year.
And you say that the government, your organization has fought to make the government aware and to get rules and regulations to protect the communities, the workers, the people around this chemical. One of the questions that has arisen is that the EPA apparently sent workers, staff EPA workers to that site who themselves did not have proper protection, PPE, and they were sickened.
Yeah, that's right. Not only were first responders sickened in East Palestine, but government employees that were responding to the disaster were as well. It actually took the government a couple of weeks to send medical professionals at the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry to evaluate the symptoms that residents and first responders were experiencing. They started going door to door, and government workers at ATSDR or CDC started getting sick. And interestingly, some of the symptoms that government employees were experiencing were symptoms that the residents and first responders were also experiencing as well, including nosebleeds, sore throats, coughing, headaches, and the list goes on. So it was really ironic that not only were residents getting sick, but government employees who are studying whether or not residents were getting sick were also impacted by the disaster. And in fact, some government employees actually had to go back to their hotels because they were not well enough to actually evaluate the health conditions in the community. So, to put it bluntly, I mean, this is one of the worst environmental health tragedies in modern American history. And I think it highlights the real dangers of petrochemicals like vinyl chloride, especially the dangers of transporting vinyl chloride and how that can impact communities in the event of a major disaster. One of the things that was really interesting about this disaster was that this was not the first time that there's been a major train derailment involving vinyl chloride. There was a similar accident that took place in Paulsboro, New Jersey, about 12 years ago. And one of the things that was interesting about that was that just like in East Palestine, many residents got sick, many first responders got sick. In fact, the levels of vinyl chloride in New Jersey at that disaster were so high that first responders could have died because the levels of vinyl chloride were so high in the air. In fact, if you take a look at photos from that accident, there was literally, you could actually see a vapor cloud of vinyl chloride in the air that first responders were literally standing in. And in that disaster, first responders were told not even to wear PPE equipment in some cases. So this is a second major disaster involving the rail shipment of vinyl chloride. And in both cases, the chemicals were traveling from the very same chemical plant in Texas, operated by Oxyvinyls, right outside of Houston, Texas. And in both cases, the vinyl chloride was traveling nearly 2,000 miles across the country to another Oxy plant in New Jersey. So this is a second major derailment in 2 years involving the very same chemical corporation. And one of the things that's notable about that is Oxy is actually the biggest producer of vinyl chloride in the United States. They're not only one of the biggest producers, but they're also one of the biggest polluters. And they've known about the dangers that vinyl chloride has posed to workers and to communities for decades. And it's a real tragedy that here we are decades after we've learned about the dangers of this chemical, that companies are still allowed to manufacture it and to transport it, putting workers and community members and first responders at serious risk of illness and disease.
And what explanation is for the fact that they know, the government knows about this? This is, as you say, a second accident, real accident involving vinyl chloride. Yet the staff of these government agencies who are supposed to be doing oversight and protection of the people of the United States themselves are not protected and prepared.
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon when there are major industrial accidents for first responders like firefighters and police officers to not be properly trained on what type of PPE they should be wearing. It's not uncommon for first responders also to not get information in a timely manner on the contents of chemicals or materials that are involved in a major disaster. We see this time and time again. And you know, that's a failure of our federal regulatory system, which also, it's not only about health and safety in terms of responding to a disaster, but it's also the fact that it's completely legal for large chemical companies like Oxy to continue to manufacture highly hazardous chemicals that we know are harmful to communities and workers. Vinyl chloride is one of the few chemicals that the federal government classifies as a known human carcinogen. It, as I mentioned, can cause a rare form of liver cancer called angiosarcoma of the liver, but it also can cause other types of cancer as well, including lung cancer, breast cancer, and brain cancer. And we've known about the dangers of this chemical for decades, but unfortunately, our federal regulatory system continues to allow big multinational chemical companies to manufacture highly hazardous chemicals that put both workers and frontline environmental justice communities at risk. And as we saw in East Palestine, that not only puts communities and workers at risk from the manufacture, but also when these chemicals are transported and when there is a derailment, that can spell disaster for local communities. And as we saw in East Palestine, the government's response to this disaster was pitiful. I mean, the company itself, Oxy, actually advised Norfolk Southern that they actually did not need to purposely light the train cars on fire on purpose. In the immediate aftermath of the derailment, the train cars lit on fire. But then a few days later, on February 6th, about a year ago, they then purposely ignited 5 train cars on fire, which made an enormous problem probably 1,000 times worse. And that has proved to be devastating for the local community, because in the days that followed after the ignition of the vinyl chloride rail cars, people were told that it was safe to return to their homes, even though there was very little testing that had been taking place. There was little to no adequate indoor air monitoring that was done in people's homes or businesses or schools or other government buildings. There was little to no testing of people's bodies to determine whether or not they were exposed to harmful chemicals. And also, the evacuation zone was quite minimal. The evacuation zone was only about a 2-mile radius. Meanwhile, we know that the plume traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles. For example, I live in New York State, about 7 hours away, and a few days after the vent and burn in East Palestine, I can even smell it and see the plume here in New York, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So this was one of the worst modern environmental disasters, and it was also an example of how the government was ill prepared to respond to a major environmental tragedy. Here we are, 20 years after 9/11, another major environmental disaster, and we thought that we would have learned some of the lessons from 9/11. But sadly, many of the mistakes that were made at 9/11 were repeated once again. And
Well,
unfortunately,
is this a mistake? If the company was told, Norfolk Southern, by the manufacturer, that this was dangerous and should not be done, and then they do it, couldn't they be criminally prosecuted?
well, I think they should be. And certainly we know that there's a lot of litigation. The EPA has been holding Norfolk Southern accountable. There's been a lot of lawsuits filed on behalf of residents. So we certainly think that that should be closely looked at, given that they were advised by the company owner, Oxyvinyls, not to purposely ignite the vinyl chloride. And why do they ignite 5 train cars? They were originally mostly concerned about 1 or 2 of them, but then they lit all 5 of them on fire, lighting
Well,
the.
is that the reason, probably, is that they wanted to get the railroad running again?
Yeah, I mean,
And, it's a commercial thing. They wanted to get that rail track going. That, it seems to me, also is criminally liable. In other words, their business interests, getting the railroad running again, was more important than protecting the residents and the
Yeah, I mean,
workers at that area.
it's clear they really wanted to get the rail shipment moving again, and what they really cared about was the bottom line. They cared about the almighty dollar. They were really thinking about their corporate profits as opposed to thinking about what was in the best interests for local residents, for first responders, and other folks in the community. And it's not only a public health and occupational health issue, but it was also a ecological disaster, as you noted. Thousands and thousands of fish and other wildlife died as a result of the disaster. There were water bodies that were significantly contaminated, like Sulphur Run, which today, 1 year later, still remains contaminated. You can literally go there and see a sheen of petrochemicals in that water body. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that federal prosecutors and other attorneys really need to look at how Norfolk should be held criminally liable for this, especially corporate executives, at the company who are very well paid, probably much more well paid compared to folks that work on the rail lines. We know that the rail lines, the people that work on rail lines, they're understaffed and overworked. You can have a train car with hundreds of train cars traveling on any one line, and you might only have 2 employees working there.
Staffing, of course, has been an issue with the railroad workers. They've been fighting for legislation, which has been blocked
Yes.
by the railroad companies. And people, I think, in this country should know that in Europe and Japan, they do not have the number of wrecks and railroad, wrecks that we have in this country. So apparently, American capitalism is saying it's okay to have wrecks every day on the railroad. It's okay to blow up towns. That's just the cost of doing business.
Yeah, and it's going to happen again. We actually just a couple weeks ago put out a report that looked at, well, how much vinyl chloride is regularly shipped by rail at any given moment. Because as I mentioned, one of the things that was notable was that this was the second time that there's been a major train disaster involving this chemical that was traveling from chemical plants in Texas to chemical plants in New Jersey. And we were shocked to learn that at any given moment, there are 200 rail cars traveling across the country from oxyvinyl plants in Texas, making their way on a nearly 2,000-mile journey to plastics facilities, not only in New Jersey, but Illinois, as well as Niagara Falls, Canada. And over the course of a year, the chemical industry ships about 1.5 billion pounds of vinyl chloride by rail on an annual basis. So it's only a matter of time before disaster like this strikes again. So we not only need legislation enacted to improve rail safety, but at the same time, we also need the EPA to step up and to ban this cancer-causing chemical once and for all. This is bound to happen again without policy reform at the federal level with rail safety and also EPA action. One of the things that is a little bit of a bright spot is in December, the EPA announced that they're going to consider whether or not to regulate vinyl chloride under the Federal Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. That's the law that gives the government the authority to regulate dangerous chemicals. When Congress first passed TSCA back in the 1970s, one of the reasons why they passed it in the first place was because of emerging concern about chemicals like vinyl chloride. The Nixon administration actually noted that when this legislation was being considered back in the 1970s. Here we are, more than 40 years later, in vinyl chloride, there's between 10 and 20 billion pounds of this chemical that continues to be manufactured on an annual basis here in the United States. And that is putting workers at risk, communities at risk, and everyday consumers as well, as we saw in East Palestine. So if there's any good that's going to come out of this disaster, certainly there's been no good thus far, but if any good comes out of it, it could be a couple things. One, new rail safety policy enacted at the federal level. Unfortunately, companies like Norfolk Southern have been lobbying against this, even though they have had to spend more than $1 billion responding to this disaster. And then at the same time, we need the EPA to take action. And then we also need action from the business community. Retailers like the Home Depot and Lowe's that profit off of the sale of products made with vinyl chloride need to step up and ban the sale of products that contain that are made from this cancer-causing chemical that is poisoning frontline environmental justice communities and putting everyday American workers at risk day in and day out.
And one of the issues and concerns of the residents were that they were not getting information about vinyl chloride. The government knew about it. The company knew about it. The EPA did not visit the residents, did not inform them of the dangers of these toxins. And residents now are fearful that they're going to get, they have gotten, they're getting heart disease. They're having all kinds of health problems as a result of this contamination. And some are losing their health care benefits because they can't work and their health care is tied to their work. One of the issues that is raised is regulatory capture. That even though you have government regulations, you have government rules, they're not even enforcing their rules and regulations. OSHA doesn't have enough inspectors. In California, where I'm from, there are less than 200 OSHA inspectors for 18 million workers. I don't know OSHA in Ohio, but these government agencies, which are supposed to protect the health and safety of the working people of this country, are underfunded, and basically, in many cases, they've been captured by the companies they're supposed to be regulating. Are you concerned about regulatory capture? And also, what are the lessons of the fact that the residents and workers of East Palestine, whether you have Democratic or Republican administrations, are not being protected?
Yeah, no, I think you raise a lot of important issues, and there's a lot to unpack there. If we look at the current president and the last president, at least at the EPA, the Biden administration generally has done a much better job of protecting public health and the environment compared to the Trump administration. I mean, it's night and day. In fact, the Trump administration had actually hired a former lobbyist from the chemical industry to run the EPA's toxics office for a number of years, and that was a classic case of the fox guarding the hen house. Over the last 3+ years now, the EPA has really been trying to turn that ship around. And to their credit, the EPA has begun proposing bans on other dangerous chemicals like methylene chloride and trichloroethylene and others under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And we're hopeful that EPA will also consider banning vinyl chloride as well. Certainly, though, I think you're right that the chemical industry has a lot of undue influence over how regulations are enforced and written here in the United States. We've seen that for decades. And that's why we as U.S. residents, whether you're on the left or right, we really need to step up and participate in democratic processes. In the case of East Palestine, unfortunately, I think that the federal response has been a dismal failure. While the EPA has done, some good things responding to the disaster, a lot has gone wrong. One of the big issues is they have not conducted sufficient indoor air testing in people's homes in areas where people have been complaining about odors that are likely attributable to chemicals getting into their homes from the derailment. Another big issue is that there are many people that want to be permanently relocated. They don't feel safe going back into their homes because when they return to East Palestine and other nearby communities, they get sick. Here we are a year later, people are still getting sick. And in December, Norfolk Southern announced that they were going to be cutting off temporary relocation this month. So many residents are calling for permanent relocation. And then, as you also noted, healthcare is also a huge issue for many people. Many of the communities in and near East Palestine, these are not rich communities. Many people do not have adequate healthcare. So we really need the government to step up and issue a major disaster declaration so that community residents and others can get the resources that they need. And that includes things like immediate and long-term health care. We know that the Stafford Act could enable that. We've seen that happen in other major disasters. Another thing that we need is long-term medical monitoring. People in East Palestine and nearby communities were exposed to a witch's brew of toxic chemicals, and we have no idea what the long-term health impacts of exposure to that toxic cocktail of chemicals and particulate matter is going to be. We probably won't know for decades, especially given the fact that there was a lack of adequate testing in the communities in the immediate days and weeks in the aftermath of the disaster when the chemical contaminants were at the greatest concentrations. For example, it took EPA more than a month to begin sampling for dioxins in the soil in communities downwind of the disaster. And the sampling for dioxins has been really limited to a very small geographic area. So President Biden really needs to step up and make not only the community of East Palestine whole, but other communities that have been, communities and workers that have been devastated by this tragedy. And that's why we and a coalition of nearly 200 local, state, and national groups this week sent a letter to President Biden and EPA Administrator Reagan calling on them to issue a major disaster declaration and do a number of things to provide healthcare and other assistance to people that have continued to suffer. And, this is also an election year. We need the Biden administration to step up and show that they're going to do the right thing and make these residents and make these communities whole. The day we're speaking, President Biden is actually traveling to East Palestine today, and he's going to be meeting with residents. He's going to be meeting with government agencies. He's going to be speaking to the press. Now is the time for President Biden to issue a major disaster declaration and help this community and other communities nearby that continue to suffer because of the government's poor response to this massive tragedy.
Well, in last year, I believe the residents of East Palestine went to the governor's office, Governor Devine, and asked him to ask the federal government, Biden administration, to issue a national declaration so that they could get protection, they could get health care. And President Biden has not acted on that.
Yeah.
The Stafford Act, he's going to visit East Palestine. He could declare it under the Stafford Act a mass casualty incident site. which would allow the residents and the workers to get health care so that they don't have to worry about not getting the drugs and other health care that they need now that it's running out. They may die from lack of health care. How do you look at it that workers and residents there may die because they don't have health care after a catastrophe caused by Norfolk Southern and a president who won't order it, which
I
he can
mean,
do under the law? I mean, he can do that. He could
yeah,
order that they get health care. It seems, and especially in an election year, why wouldn't he do that? Is this an example of basically the Democrats, like the Republicans, being captured by these corporations? I mean, the corporations would have the liability probably if they did order a mass incident casualty site. They could then charge Norfolk Southern for the health care costs. What is the reason that he's not doing what should be a simple thing to do and a necessary thing to do to protect the residents and workers of
yeah.
East Palestine?
But I think that they're worried about the precedent that this could set with other major disasters. I mean, as we've talked about, there are train derailments that happen every day. There are accidents and explosions that happen at chemical plants on a regular basis. So I think they are worried about the precedent that this could set, but this is not an ordinary train derailment or ordinary chemical accident. This is one of the worst environmental disasters in modern American history. This, rivals similar disasters like Love Canal, Times Beach, Missouri. And in those incidences, the government did step in and provide much needed services to local folks. So for example, in the cases of both Love Canal and Times Beach, Missouri, they evacuated those communities where people wanted to relocate. They could do that again. As you noted, they can leverage the Stafford Act and issue a major disaster declaration so that people can receive the health care that they need so that they don't suffer. They can also provide financial resources to set up long-term medical monitoring, as we've seen in other major environmental disasters. One of the things that really struck us as we were looking at this recently was that there's been, some other incidents that have taken place over the last 20 years that are pretty similar. For example, at the World Trade Center after 9/11, and also in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, U.S. vets were exposed to a witch's brew of toxic contaminants from burn pits. Both the World Trade Center and in the case of Iraq, the government has provided healthcare resources to people that may have been impacted, and they've also set up health registries to monitor the health of people in the long term. And these are the types of programs that we need to replicate here in East Palestine, because like at the World Trade Center and like during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we didn't exactly know what people were exposed to because of the lack of monitoring. And that is the exact same thing that's happened here in East Palestine. And that's exactly why we need President Biden to work together with members of Congress, but Biden can do this alone. He can issue a major disaster declaration. Look, the governor of Ohio has requested it. We know that there are members of Congress that have supported it, and we think that they need to work together to provide justice to the workers and residents and first responders in East Palestine and other nearby communities. And that's important to note. It's not just about East Palestine. Where the derailment took place is really just a stone's throw away from the Pennsylvania border. And there are communities in border towns in Pennsylvania that also have been impacted by this.
And Uniontown and Pikeston in Ohio. And joining us also is Chris, and he's on the ground in East Palestine. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, how are you?
Good. So we're talking with Mike Schade about the toxin and the need to get the Stafford Act to get health care. Maybe you can talk about, from your point of view as a resident and a worker, what's going on and whether or not the president is going to issue this mass declaration so that you can get health care.
Well, I can only hope that is what he's going to do. That's the right thing to do. It's needed. A lot of us here are suffering due to something that was not in our control nor our fault. Me personally, I have not been able to work since April of last year. Due to this, I developed heart issues. I'm suffering from severe heart failure. I have to take like 8 different medications every single day. And with that being said, my health insurance expired on December 31st. So I now no longer have health insurance to pay for these medicines that I need. I don't want to take them. I need to take them. And without him signing the Stafford Act, I don't know what's going to happen. My health will probably decline and I'll be dead. So he definitely needs to do this.
And also, we were talking earlier with Mike about the EPA, and the EPA was aware that vinyl chloride is a dangerous chemical, that and the EPA apparently allowed Norfolk Southern to ignite that toxin on the railroad cars. Your experience was that EPA was MIA, apparently. Is that the case?
Absolutely. We had no idea about the EPA, what they were doing, how they were doing anything whatsoever, until I had an article published about me and what's happened to me in the New York Times. The day after that article came out, the EPA called me. I didn't recognize the number, so I didn't answer it. And then the very next day after that, they were here at my door. Why weren't they here before? Why weren't they checking on everybody? Not just me, but everybody. To see how everybody was doing, and making sure that things were okay. We did have, at the one point in time, we were basically gutting our house and getting rid of anything that could have been permeated by the chemicals. We had a dumpster outside, and I just happened to be out there by the dumpster, and they were taking air readings, and they stopped right by our house and said they were getting an elevated reading right there.
Wow.
Didn't tell us what it was, didn't tell us if it was dangerous, didn't tell us how high it was, said nothing. Told me there was an elevated reading and went about their way.
And the fact that you've been basically forced to move back in the house, that Norfolk Southern hasn't been compensating people for their homes if they want to move out, you're basically locked into what is a nightmare situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We can't, especially with me not working right now. I have no income as of right now. I'm bringing nothing into this house. How are we supposed to move? We'd love to be able to get out. We love this community. We love this town. We love the schools. But we need to get out for our health. And we just can't do that. We just can't pick up and go. Financially, it's impossible. Just picking everything up. My wife has been in this house for 20 years now, I believe, 19, 20 years. Just to pick everything up, find a place. We have 2 dogs and a cat that's going to take pets. We have, 2 kids still living at home. We just can't do it. We'd love to be able to get out, but we just can't do it. Actually, we just can't do it.
And President Biden is visiting that community today. And we were talking earlier that he could issue a declaration. What's going on? Why wouldn't he want to protect the residents of East Palestine, the workers and residents of East Palestine who are stuck in this situation? I'm sure President Biden wouldn't want to have to be forced to live in East Palestine for probably one more than a day.
That'd be kind of funny if he was invited to move the White House to East Palestine. We'll see how quickly the government would step up and bring resources to the community. I'm sure things would be much different in that sort of situation.
And also, the community is having a rally today, members of the community for Trump. The government is calling for, this is the big issue in the U.S. government at this point. Congress, they want billions, $90 billion for Ukraine. They want money for Israel. They want money for Taiwan, billions and billions of dollars. Yet it seems that protecting the residents of East Palestine is an obstacle, is not a primary issue in this country. It really is amazing. Is that why people in East Palestine are pissed off? One of the reasons?
Absolutely. First of all, it took him over a year to come here. I understand we are a predominantly Republican conservative town. I get that, but he is still our president. He is still the guy who is supposed to be in charge of us and in protecting us. And he has done nothing. We have been completely forgotten. He has flown directly over top of us. You just mentioned how much aid we've given to foreign countries, Ukraine and everything. We're in the billions of dollars. What about us? We are your constituents. We are your citizens. We are here in this country, and we're not getting the help we need. And that's a shame. That's a shame that our own president can't step up and see this and understand it and help us. And by definitely declaring the Stafford Act and getting us health care, that would be a huge step. Because I know I'm not the only one who is suffering medically and financially with this. So,
and the issue of how many, I mean, one thing that the government could do, the CDC, the government could do surveys of all the residents and workers and find out. We're talking earlier, we even just found out that government officials, staff who went there themselves got sick because of the toxin, that they didn't have PPE, they didn't have proper protection. So it sounds like, not only can they not protect the residents and people of Palestine, they couldn't even protect government workers who came there to find out what was going on.
Exactly. I didn't even realize it, but at the time, whenever the New York Times was here interviewing us, that the workers were actually getting sick. They kept that quiet. They didn't say anything about that, and they just kind of let that go. Like, it's even right here. But 200 cleanup workers still arrive each day working on 1.4, and it talks about them all being sick and they had to leave. They're getting sick whenever they were here. But it was okay and it was safe for us to come back, according to the EPA.
And Mike, the workers, the cleanup workers, is there supervision and oversight of these cleanup workers? Are they getting protected? Because you're dealing with highly toxic material. And as you were saying, people don't even know the effects of this long term. If workers go to clean up. So we're talking about all these workers being brought in, not being told of the dangers, and they themselves getting sick, who are trying to clean up the site.
Yeah, I can't speak to the specifics there, but we have seen in other situations where workers who came in to clean up after other major environmental disasters got sick. We saw it after 9/11 at the World Trade Center, where many folks that came in to do cleanup got sick. We saw it in the Gulf of Mexico after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, when dispersants were being utilized to clean up the pollution. Many of the folks that responded to the Deepwater Horizon spill got sick as well. So that's definitely a very, very real concern. And that's a key reason why we need the president to issue an emergency declaration so that people can receive the health care and other resources to protect themselves in the long term. Because we really don't know what the long-term impacts may be. But here's what we do know. People that live in the community over the last year have gotten sick. People will probably only continue to get sick over time, because for some of the chemicals that people are exposed to, like dioxins and vinyl chloride, the cancers that people may develop, that may not materialize for decades. And that's why we need the government to step in and provide long-term solutions, not just Band-Aid solutions to this problem. And as the president prepares to travel and visit East Palestine today, now would be the best time, especially in an election year, to do the justice to give justice to the community as it deserves. Now is really the time. And wouldn't it be such a great present for this community to hear the president issuing this emergency declaration today?
It seems like a no-brainer. He's running for office. It's something he can offer. He has the ability to do that, to say to the residents and workers of East Palestine, you're going to get health care. You're going to get protection. And I think that's what they were asking. There was a rally there today of residents to demand that. And I think that's the just thing to do, the right thing to do for the people and workers of East Palestine. And also there's going to be a rally or a conference, education conference on March the 23rd in East Palestine. And Chris is going to be there. And I think, Mike, you're welcome to come as well, because I think, as we were saying earlier, unfortunately, these toxic dump sites are not limited to East Palestine. In Ohio, you have the Pikestown nuclear processing facility where workers there have been getting sick, residents. You have Uniontown in Ohio. There are all these toxic dump sites. And what we were talking about earlier is that may be one reason they don't want to declare it a mass incident casualty site, because there's so many other sites, highly toxic dump sites around the United States. I'm from San Francisco. The Hunters Point Shipyard and Treasure Island are nuclear radioactive dump sites where workers have been getting sick and residents have been getting sick. So it seems like it's a systemic problem. If you do it for East Palestine, workers and community people in other places will say, we want the same rights. I mean, but healthcare, of course, should be a right for everyone in this country. People should have the right to healthcare, and that's what they don't have right now in East Palestine and other communities.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that's a key reason why we need him to issue this emergency declaration. And at the same time, as you noted, pollution from the petrochemical and the plastics industry is rampant across the country. As I mentioned earlier, companies produce between 10 and 20 billion pounds of vinyl chloride here in the United States every year, and these are huge, massive multinational corporations that are reaping record profits to produce a chemical that we know can cause cancer in people. So the EPA not only needs to step in and conduct more monitoring in the community, we not only need Biden to issue a declaration to provide health care and long-term medical monitoring in the community. People that want to be relocated should be provided resources so that they can leave the community. But at the same time, we need the federal government to finally ban vinyl chloride once and for all. Here we are in the 21st century. There's no reason why we should be continuing to produce chemicals that can cause cancer in people, especially when we know that there are safer alternatives available. We know in Europe, the European Union is considering whether or not to regulate vinyl chloride. A number of US states are enacting legislation to ban PVC plastic. Now is the time also for the EPA to step up and ban vinyl chloride. And that's something that this administration must also take a very close look at and really prioritize in the year ahead and in the years ahead.
And Chris, this struggle for your health care, for your family, for the future of your community, seems like it's going to go on regardless, that you have no choice.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, personally, like with my heart and everything, I'm going to be taking all those medications probably for the rest of my life. Like we just spoke about, we don't know the long-term effects of what's going to happen. We have 3 kids. What's going to happen to them? Are they going to develop cancer? Are they going to have problems, with reproductive issues and things like that down the road? We don't know. We don't know any of this stuff. And again, this was something that was caused not by our own fault. This was done by negligence from a billion-dollar company. And we're the ones left suffering. And we don't know how we're going to get through this. And we don't know what's going to happen to us down the road. And there's so many unanswered questions and things like that. And we really deserve to get health care.
Absolutely. That's a basic human right. And I think people in this country need to demand it. And the labor movement. I mean, there's been silence by the national unions in this country, the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters, the CWA, my union, Steelworkers, which is in Pittsburgh. I mean, it seems that these national unions, their members are in East Palestine. The labor,
exactly.
Their members are in East Palestine. Their members are in the area, and they need to defend them. Their members are losing their health care because of this accident, because of a system in which you only get your health care if you're working. That's another issue that we're taking up. And I think you want to take that up as well, Mike, in that the national labor movement, who are backing Biden? Most of
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is historically there was this argument of jobs versus the environment and, can the labor community and the environmental community work together? And I think this is an opportunity where the labor community and the environmental and the public health communities can come together and, really join forces to advocate for people in East Palestine and other nearby communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania that have been impacted by this terrible petrochemical disaster. I think you're right. We know that Ohio is a big union state. There are a lot of people that live in communities in and near East Palestine that are part of the unionized workforce, and we need some of the big national labor unions to step up and join us in calling for President Biden to issue an emergency declaration. As I mentioned, this week we sent a letter to the president and the EPA that was signed by nearly 200 groups across the country. Sadly, no major national unions signed on, and while there was only a short amount of time for people to consider signing on, we'd really like to see more labor leaders step up and join forces hand in hand with us and other folks in East Palestine to demand justice so that these folks can be made whole once and for all. And again, it's not just about East Palestine. Communities around Ohio and Pennsylvania that have also been impacted by this terrible, terrible disaster, but especially people in East Palestine that have been hardest hit, especially deserve justice today.
And if any trade unions are listening to this, they should get their union to support the brothers and sisters in East Palestine. Basic human right to get their health care. And I agree, the labor movement, the unions need to stand up for their members, whether they're in unions or not. But even there are members who are losing health care because they're sick and can't work. So I think that's a campaign that's going to continue. We're going to be taking that up at this conference we're having in East Palestine on March the 23rd. This is not ending. We're not stopping here. We're going to continue this fight until you get what you have a right to, what you should have a right to, Chris. So we're going to be here with you.
Yeah, this is not something I ever wanted. This was not something that I asked for. I'd love to go back to February 2nd and still be working and still having, everything that was coming that I had in my life at that point in time. And again, because of something that was not my fault, I am now unable to work and have lost health care. So yeah, we definitely need to stress the importance of that and get that out to President Biden and have him sign that declaration.
Well, I want to thank both of you, Mike Schade and Chris Albright, for joining us today. And I think we haven't heard yet. I don't know what's going to be the result of President Biden's visit, but we're not stopping. We're going to continue this fight to protect the health and safety, the lives of the people of East Palestine and working people in this country. So thanks for joining us.
I had a pleasure being here.
Very good. Take care.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.